Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the Finding You podcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, January 21st, 2025. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about grief and loss. This subject actually came to me from a listener as a suggestion that I asked for last week. I actually got a couple, and I'll be running those out over the next couple of weeks. But one of the suggestions was to talk about grief and loss, especially in light of all of the natural disasters that are happening in Southern California with the fires, all of the loss that's happening there. And I thought it was a great opportunity to talk about the nature of grief, the nature of complicated grief and complex grief, especially when some of the things that are being lost are things, are not necessarily people, but are actually things that we identify with. So I'm looking forward to doing that this evening and to share some of my own stories with that. I want to talk for just a minute about what we have upcoming at Finding You. First of all, our Finding You Intensive. We just completed another one. And I'm doing a new thing now where even when I'm not running them, I'm welcoming the group on that first evening. And I really found it to be a joy to welcome people there. In fact, one of the participants said when he found out that I wasn't running the group, that he thought that he was disappointed. And then he found out later, after spending time with Emma, Reedy June, and Jordan June, that he probably ended up with the A team. And I'd love to hear that. Finding You is a deep dive for 7 individuals into your history, into your family of origin. I can't say too much about it. I can predict with as much confidence as I can predict anything that it's absolutely transformational for nearly everybody who attends. It's not uncommon for people at the last minute, and several folks shared this with us, at the last minute to feel uncomfortable, to look for excuses, to consider not coming. But those who make it inevitably end up experiencing something that they've never experienced in their life. I can't recommend it too strongly. Our next in-person session will be February 19th through 23rd. So get on that soon. That will fill up. March 19th through 23rd, which is already beginning to fill up, will also be on the calendar. And then we have an online program, March 14th through 16th, where you get a taste of Finding You. It's about a third of the cost, about half of the time, and you don't have to travel. So if time and money are at a premium for you, the online option is wonderful. So we have one of those each month. We also have custom intensives for families and couples. You can always contact info@findingyouprograms.com to learn more or to inquire about a custom program. Upcoming, we have our attachment-based therapy class, a master class, on March 7th. I'll be teaching that from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Mountain Time. And then we have our next iteration of the Conscious Parenting Workshop. And because it's a dialogue, because it's something that we do together, each one of those is different. I continue to try to make it more and more interactive. So it's more than just listening to these podcasts or these lectures, but really having a dialogue with me and being able to understand how the principles, the ideas that we talk about here apply to your life in a very practical way. Myself and my wife, Michelle, will be hosting a couples intensive sometime late this winter, early spring. So if you're interested in that, let us know. Again, all of this can be accessed by emailing info@findingyouprograms.com. We're just looking for a critical mass to set the dates with that. So let's get into tonight's broadcast on grief and loss. First off, the relationship that we have with grief and loss is really the relationship that we have with life. And if we accept the temporal nature, the temporary nature of life, we can feel all of our other feelings. As the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, to help dying people, you must be very solid. You must be very fearless within you. You have to accept the impermanence of life. I've told this story in the past many times, coming from a Buddhist perspective, being influenced by the Buddhist teachings. I shared with one of my young children, and used to on a regular occasion, I would say to her, everybody that we know and love is going to be gone, is going to be dead in 100 years from now. What do you think we should do about that? And for your fear that might sound morbid, it was just a fun little exercise that we would do. And she would say, I want to talk about how much fun that we had today. When we embrace or accept or lean into the impermanence of life, we get access to all of the other feelings. If we block it, if we try to, as Freud says, bury our feelings alive, they will come back to us in difficult, uglier ways. And so we have to feel them. We have to go through them. I like this suggestion because I've been noticing something in my life. And I'll tell a couple of stories to begin this. I've been watching people while I and others have shared statements of grief and loss with them. And I've been watching how common it is for people to shut down or to turn away, actually physically, from such a sharing. I've told the story. I was on Broadway some time ago, maybe a year and a half ago, and I was watching a musical where my good friend was the lead actor, the lead in the musical. It was the Neil Diamond show, and our mutual friend, who we were both very close to, had hoped and looked forward. He was a big Broadway fan, much more so than even I, and how he was looking forward to this performance. It was something that the lead actor had looked forward to his entire life. Will Swenson is his name. And unfortunately, our close friend, this third member of the triangle or the triad, on his way to see the opening or the previews of A Beautiful Noise, the Neil Diamond story, he got sick and he went home. He had to get off the airplane, leave the airport actually, and go home. And he ended up in the hospital. And it was just a few weeks later that he passed away from natural causes, from some health concerns that had plagued him for a long time. So fast forward, I'm on Broadway, I'm watching the show, and I'm, of course, elated because it's a beautiful story. I grew up on Neil Diamond, my mother playing Neil Diamond, Hot August Night in the background of my youth, of my childhood. And so I knew all the songs. It was touching me on so many levels. Of course, my friend was the lead actor, and I just loved watching him act and sing and perform. But there was also a ghost in the room. Our missing friend, my close friend, the closest person that I've ever known, who I've lost, was missing there. And there were times during the performance when I was sad and longing for him. Anyway, afterwards, there was a small gathering of friends outside, and a couple asked me what I thought of the play, not knowing the backstory. And I tried to answer authentically. And as I did, and I started to mention that it was wonderful, but that there was something for me that was very touching on my grief, something that uncovered my grief with the loss of this mutual friend. As I started to tell that story, I lost my ability to talk. I became very emotional, and I had to pause while I gathered myself so I could just get the words out. And when I looked back up just a few seconds later, the individual who had asked me the question had turned away and started talking to somebody else. And I remember feeling absolutely humiliated. I beat myself up for a little while, saying I shouldn't have shared something so authentic. I should have just said the musical was great and it was wonderful and wasn't Will wonderful. I could have just stayed there, but I didn't. And after we left and we were walking toward our hotel, I was sharing this with my family, and my daughter said to me, Dad, it wasn't you. You weren't the weird one. You didn't do anything inappropriate. You were just answering honestly, and what came up for you was the grief and the love and the loss that you were feeling for our friend Peter. And that did help. It helped to realize that, but I still had that feeling in me. It's that experience that I shared some with somebody, because of their inability, their lack of capacity to simply sit with it, to hold the very big feeling, which was unexpected, I'm sure. Their inability or unwillingness to hold it left me feeling inadequate. And I think that story, as I've thought about that about 18 months ago, I've seen it over and over again. I've been watching for it. My daughter's been watching for it. We've been sharing stories. I've had clients share very similar experiences where they share intense grief with other people when asked in situations, when talking about it, and the other person almost literally turns away. And it just got me thinking about how much capacity and courage it takes to sit with somebody in their difficult, unsolvable problems. And when somebody can't sit with us because of our background, because of our human personality structure, when somebody can't sit with us, we end up walking away with the feeling of inadequacy in us. And so much of my therapy with people is about holding space for them, giving them an alternative experience to the ones that they've had before, so that they can learn to sit and express their feelings. So tonight, I'm talking, I think, mostly to those that are not in acute grief. I remember some years ago, somebody contacted me after the loss of a child and was very interested in creating something with our intensive program. And they asked me if I would be willing to host them and their family to talk about it. I said, I will. I'm happy to. But I also warn you're in the early stages of grief, and for the most part, it's just going to be sitting and listening. I will do very little facilitating with a group of people who are so new and raw in their grief experience. But once we're out of the grief experience, or if we're the person that's being asked to hold space, the principles that I will talk about tonight can be helpful in navigating it all. Fred Rogers, one of his famous, beautiful quotes, and he has so many of them, said, anything that's human is mentionable. And anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. When we talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. The people we trust with that important talk can help us know that we are not alone. So much of psychotherapy, so much of relationships, so much of parenting is about this idea of co-regulation and holding space. It doesn't have to be about grief, but I think grief is sort of the ultimate example of holding feelings because it can be so powerful. It can feel so deep. It can feel like that if I get into it, I'm never going to get out of it. And if I talk about it, it's only going to get worse. That's the feeling that so many people have. But by being an adequate container, by developing the wherewithal, the capacity to just sit and be present with somebody, to ask questions. Tell me about the person. How are you feeling? How long has it been? Let them tell stories about the person. And just be with them. And in so many ways, I have come to experience that sitting with somebody in their grief is the most sacred, beautiful experience that I have as a therapist. And I have it around so many issues, not just the death of a loved one, of a close loved one, but about the past, about the childhood that was lost, about the feelings, about the time that was lost, about those portions of our life that we weren't living our most authentic life, about the loss of a marriage, about the loss of what we hoped for, what we were planning on, the life that we had planned, as Joseph Campbell says. So in so many ways, and my daughter said this to me not too long ago, she herself being a really, like I've mentioned already, a very gifted therapist and coach. She said to me, Dad, I think in so many ways, therapy is just about helping people grieve, no matter what the topic, no matter what the content. And if my first idea that I shared with you tonight is true, it makes sense because grief is just life. Grief is about dealing with the transient, constantly moving nature of our lives, our relationships, our circumstances. Again, thinking of those of us who are around other people that are grieving. Thich Nhat Hanh said, the secret of creating peace is that when you listen to another person, you have only one purpose, to offer him an opportunity to empty his heart. And like I have found recently, that is something that is so overlooked or misunderstood. And the result of having an inadequate container when one shares one's feeling is a feeling of inadequacy, of shame. Something is wrong with me. And that's what our children have. I've said it many times, and I don't need to go into great detail because it applies so globally. My mother shared with me in her late 60s, early 70s, sometime around then, on a drive to the airport, she said, when you were young, you were just too big. Your feelings were big, your thoughts were big, and you were too big for me. And I didn't know what to do. I wasn't up to it. And while I had worked out the issue myself to a large degree in my own psychotherapy, it was a nice gift for her to offer me. And what she was confessing, which is so true for all of us as children, all of our children, is that sometimes we lack the capacity, we lack the strength, we lack the courage, we lack the ability. We don't even know it's the task to hold space. Because our instinct is to protect our children and we see pain as an existential threat at a visceral level, we don't even know that the task is to hold space. So much of the time in psychotherapy, when people are feeling that point in therapy where their self-awareness is increased, but they're having the same patterns, they're talking about the same things, they feel shame for bringing back the same stories, things that they had in their own mind conquered long ago are still themes of their current therapy sessions. When that happens, I will at times try to explain to them that psychotherapy, while it is skill building, while it is insight and making connections and understanding, and that does give us some clarity, some peace, what we're really doing is we're trying to reparent the client, trying to give them a safe base, a sense of self, reconnect them to their most authentic self. And that takes time. Doesn't matter how smart or intelligent the therapist or the book or the quotation is. The thing that's going on in our human development is something much deeper than that. It's why, for example, in my own life, while all of my successes that I accumulated academically, financially, and other areas of my life didn't really do the trick to fill that hole. Because the hole was created by the absence of my parents, by their inability to create an environment where I was seen, not just the successful, bright, and shiny parts, but all of me with patience and compassion. So the idea, and this, like so much of I talk about, the idea in understanding the process of grief is a sort of reparenting experience. Somebody pouring out their heart and somebody else listening and being present with them. And if that happens at important stages of our life, important trauma moments of our life, the trauma is metabolized. The trauma moves through us, not immediately, not in days, but the trauma is able to move through us. It doesn't get stuck in us. I learned long after the fact, and so much of what I share for you is retrospective, right? I'm looking back and naming things that happened at the time. What I learned about my experience in psychotherapy was, because my therapist could sit with me, could sit with my quote horrible rotten self week after week, year after year, the same dilemma, the same themes, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 3 steps back. Because she sat with me so lovingly and patiently, now I can sit with myself. And because I can sit with myself, or maybe I should say more appropriately, to the extent I can sit with myself, then I can sit with others. This is all about enlarging, becoming bigger, developing more capacity, and I'll talk about that as we go along. It's not the discussion or the content of the discussion that becomes the balm. It is the listening, the holding that becomes the balm. There were 2 times in my life when there was a death of a famous person, and that death impacted me greatly, as if I knew them. The first one was Princess Diana, and that one was even more confusing at the time because I was not a fan or a follower of British royalty. I wasn't interested in that, but there was something about her. Now I can explain what it was. Now I understand her personality even more. I did not then. What drew me to her. But there was something about her death that was the death of a part of me. The death of something I identified with in her, which was this amazing, courageous, sensitive, heart-centered person. This rebel who did it gracefully. And again, if you would have asked me before her death about her, I would have said hardly anything about her. But upon her death and the subsequent days, I was deeply moved by it. Somebody that I paid a lot more attention to was Kobe Bryant. It doesn't matter what you think about him. When he passed away, it was one of the more difficult losses in my life. And it wasn't because I knew Kobe personally. It was because of what about him that I identified with. And in some ways, it was about my children. and the time we spent going to games and cheering the Lakers on. And this was something that as a family we like to do together. So it was the death of a time in our lives. And I was embarrassed. Still, even as I say this right now, I have some anxiety about sharing the example of Princess Diana and Kobe, because I think people listening to me might judge me, might judge the ridiculousness of me using two famous people that I had no relationship with as examples of grief. But I do this very intentionally on purpose to show you that grief is so much more complex and complicated than just the relationship. Yes, if it's somebody in your life, of course, it's going to be powerfully impactful. But sometimes when they knock down an old building, when the entire Palisades goes up in flames, I visited there when I was a young person. I have friends and acquaintances who have friends there, who had friends there. Nobody got hurt. But I have friends tell me about that the loss of that neighborhood was the loss of their own childhood or a period of time in their lives. When the Los Angeles, just when the Los Angeles fires started, the week before, or about 2 weeks before, I had just spent some time at my childhood home, which I shared on an earlier broadcast right after I did it in December. And one of the things that somebody asked me was your home in danger, your childhood home? And I said, no, but I thought about that first too. I thought about the fact that I went back to this physical place, and it wasn't the stucco and the brick and the mortar that I was thinking about, or that I was feeling this powerful sense of connection to or association with. It was the time that I spent. So grief is as individual as the individual feeling it. No two people grieve the same person. No two people grieve the same thing, because their relationship to the person or the object is different, and they themselves are different. And that is why grief requires or asks of us to hold so much breath and space, because we don't know. And so when I watch the fires, I've seen I've seen floods, I've seen hurricanes, I've seen earthquakes all over the world in news reports. But when I watch those fires, because that is the place that I grew up, it has affected me emotionally. Even though the nobody that I know is in danger or been harmed in the fires, it is a part of my life that I'm losing. I remember when I was a brand new therapist, or I was training to be a therapist. I had a master's degree at the time, but I was during my doctoral program. And I remember that my wonderful, wonderful mentor and teacher, Leslie Feinauer, told us that when a child hands you a teddy bear, you treat the teddy bear as if it is the child. When a child shows you something that it loves, that he or she or they love, they're showing you a part of their own heart, a part of themselves. And if the thing that they're showing to you or sharing with you is a human being, is a picture of a human being, or like the story that I shared after that Broadway play, that Broadway musical, is the story of a close friend, of course, it's going to be all that more powerful. Really, grief and loss is about living life. It's about our relationship to everything. And the thing that we need to be supported in our grief is a lack of judgment. And I'm not talking about the most obvious critical forms of judgment. I'm talking about holding space for somebody and whatever they're feeling and whatever they're going through. At the beginning of the pandemic, I lost my father. And at the time of his death, we were not very close and hadn't been for, I guess I could say, almost all of my life. Contact when I was really young. I lived with him until I was about 7, and then intermittent contact after that until years would pass and we wouldn't talk by the end of my childhood. There was some attempt on his part and my part to make a reconnection later in adulthood, but there was nothing there. And I remember sharing with somebody days after he passed away that I lost my father. He died in April of 2020, right when the pandemic was beginning. Very, very quickly after he got COVID. And the person that I shared it with was saying to me, well, you must miss him. And I said, it's not really a missing of him. It's missing of what never was. It's really a missing of the childhood that I never had. That's what grief I feel now. And then my friend said, well, you must feel guilty then for not feeling grief. And I said, no, I don't feel guilty for not feeling grief. And my friend went on and on guessing at what I was feeling. And in every guess, they missed the mark. I remember going to a psychodrama training, and I had recently lost a friend to suicide. And at one point, I had volunteered for one of the activities, and the same kind of thing happened. I was put in a situation where I was going to share my feelings of grief, which are complicated. By complicated, I mean anything goes. Anything from relief to bitter pain, to anger, to sadness, to confusion, to resentment, to joy, anything. So I stood up, I volunteered, and I went into this exercise. And the director, using the skills to show us how to do psychodrama, was taking guesses. We call it doubling, at what I might be feeling. And every guess that she took was wrong, which was actually okay in that context, because in psychodrama, you're just making suggestions and asking the person to consider it, and they're fully welcome and encouraged to correct it. But what I thought was interesting is every guess that she had about my relationship to this recent loss was off. And I had to tell it to her as if nobody had ever grieved this person in this way, this kind of situation. So grief is complicated. It's unpredictable. There is no one grief process. It's complex. It can be about a thing, about a time, about our life. It can be about yesterday. It can be about a feeling, a person, of course. It can be just about anything. And if those things are something that are more distant from us, that's not necessarily going to take away their power. The time that when Kobe died, I was as inconsolable as I've been in my life around the loss of something. And even to this day, even on this broadcast, I feel powerful emotions coming up for me. I wrote in The Audacity to Be You, a supervisor once explained to me, I wrote, to understand and truly hear someone, sometimes you have to lose your mind. We have to get rid of our own world. We have to get out of our own world and what we need in order to understand the other. We have to get away from what we're thinking and what we're projecting onto them, what we're layering on top of them. Once I was teaching a group of psychotherapists doing a training, and I was asking them the question, what's the advantage when you have a child and somebody's dealing with a struggling child? And of course, everybody had lots of answers. Well, you have some sense of how they might be feeling. You're more likely to be empathic. You're less likely to be judgmental. You're more likely to commiserate or join with them around how difficult and impossible parenting can be at times. And the list went on very effortlessly. And then I asked the question, what is the disadvantage of having children? Or the advantage, another way I asked it was, what's the advantage of not having children? And somebody said, sometimes when we have an experience, we assume that the other person has the exact same experience if the major pieces of the puzzle are the same. And the individual sharing said, I've had several losses in my family of origin, including my father and a sibling. And sometimes when people share with me the loss of a parent or a sibling, I can easily automatically assume that I know what they're going through, and I can overlay that on top of them, and I can miss them altogether. So we shared sometimes not having a child and working as a parent coach or a therapist for a family that has a child that's struggling. Sometimes not having a child puts you in a position where you don't know, and you know you don't know. And that really is the starting place of holding space for somebody else. The things that we grieve are as endless as the things that we love and that we live in our lives. And so it would only make sense that the types, the styles, that the journey of grief is as diverse and different and varied as are the circumstances and the individuals experiencing them. So we learn to listen. Just listen. You don't have to give answers or anecdotes. Just listen to what the other person has to say. In essence, you take that in. If you've seen The Green Mile, there's a great illustration of this. You take in the pain from the other person. And because of your abilities, your capacity, you metabolize it. You feel it. You breathe through it. You sit with it. And in so doing, you reflect back to the person that they're okay. When that individual looked away from me the night of the play, I was full of shame, embarrassed, wanted to shrink. And I thought to myself, when my daughter was offering me comfort later, because like I said, she's a gifted therapist, she asked me, she said, "Dad, what would you have done if somebody had shared a similar story with you?" And that helped. I thought, I know what I would have done. I would have asked questions. I would have looked them in the eye. I would have gone quiet. And I would have showed my support by just being present with them. And it wouldn't have taken away from my evening. It might have even created a more sacred sense or feeling of that evening. Ask questions. Where did you grow up? How long did you live there? Who were they to you? How long did you know them? What was your favorite thing about them? How did you meet? People just want to tell stories. That's part of the process. They just need to be heard. They just need to feel it. But because we're human, it doesn't work as well for almost everybody to do that on our own. And AI is not gonna do the trick for us. We need another person. That is the nature of Homo sapiens. Grief is as inevitable as love is in this life. And what we need is we need another person to know that we are not alone. They can't take it away, but in a sense, in a metaphorical sense, they can carry it with us. I was talking to my therapist not very long ago about, is it okay at times to share with my clients how heavy I feel their feelings? And she encouraged me. She said, of course it is. You don't want that to take center stage, but it's okay to share that because you're letting them know that you're carrying part of it for them. You're taking part of it on. And in a sense, that's what a parent or a partner or a therapist can do for us. It's why groups are so helpful in the grieving process. It's why grief groups are often structured in such a way that there's no crosstalk. It's just listening. People just share stories the same way it happens in 12-step groups. Don't impose your version of grief on the other person. Don't assume that you know. And of course, there might be some things you relate to. That is very likely, and you can share those as you go. But if you come into the conversation assuming that you know what they feel, you are at risk of losing and missing them altogether. You will eclipse your projections, your ideas will eclipse them. And they will be out of sight, so to speak. And ultimately, to just be with them. And that's the heaviness of co-regulation. That's the heaviness of parenting. That's the heaviness of being a partner or even a therapist. Only people who avoid love can avoid grief. The point is to learn from it and remain vulnerable to love, because the option that so many people can take if they don't have safe spaces to work it out, if they don't have a history where they've been held and seen. See, trauma isn't the things that happen to us, and this is becoming more a part of the consciousness of the dominant culture now because of the teaching that's going on. But trauma isn't the thing that happens to us. Because everybody's going to experience, in a well-lived life, everybody's going to experience events that are traumatic. What is the trauma is being left alone in our pain, in our fear, in our sadness. That's the trauma. It's why, like I've shared many times in my dissertation, that we found that if somebody had a consistent person in their life that they could talk to and be seen by, the same events that others experience didn't register as trauma and didn't develop into mental health issues. But being left alone in our grief, especially being left alone when there are people present. That night when I was standing in the group and I shared my story and I was left alone, everybody was still there. Nobody had left the circle. We were gathered outside waiting for Will to arrive after getting dressed. I was standing there, and while I was standing there, I was not alone, and that made it worse because I was alone in my feelings. And of course, as I walked away and walked toward our hotel, and my wife and my daughter and my soon-to-be son-in-law started hearing my story and commenting on it, I found comfort. One of my favorite ideas that I've ever seen about grief is depicted in the movie Shadowlands, the story based on a true story of C.S. Lewis's life. And at some point, he brings his wife, who he has fallen in love with, married her for, I believe, so that she could be a citizen. And after the fact, fell in love with her, and she became ill. And they decided to go visit this place that was depicted in a painting that was in their home, this scene. And as they got to this place, the wife started to comment on the fact that this is all going to be gone soon. And in the movie, I don't know how true the story was, but C.S. Lewis tried to shush her and say, no, let's not talk about sad things now. And his wife said, the pain then, meaning the pain after she dies, she was terminal. The pain then is part of the happiness now. That's the deal. And that's the deal with life. Again, if anybody's experiencing acute grief right now, this is probably not the broadcast for them. Because some of the things I'm saying right now would violate the very principles that I'm teaching. If one of you listening was in acute grief right now, and you and I were talking, I wouldn't share any of these ideas or thoughts. I would just listen, ask questions, and sit with you. These ideas help the companions and those around us. They help us when we're not in our acute grief stage, which, by the way, can last years for some people. Someone said that the first year of grief, of losing a close loved one, is just the beginning. That the real intense grief starts after year one. That's how different and powerful it can be. But we have all our ideas about how long grief should take and what it should look like, and we judge it, and people feel that. People feel that energy, and we react to them accordingly. In the Buddhists' way of thinking, they talk about it as impermanent. You know, there's this idea, and we've seen movies, right? You've seen stories, fairy tales, where somebody is granted the ability to live forever. And when we hear that, we have a sense of relief because death and grief and loss scare us so much. They are such heavy weights on our souls. So when we hear about somebody living forever, we think it's a gift. But inevitably, it's a curse. The more permanent something is, the less alive it is. Anything alive is temporary. And in essence, like I was saying in the beginning, if our relationship to impermanence is underdeveloped, if we haven't accepted it, we haven't accepted life. I've told you many times, that was the issue that brought Darth Vader to the dark side, is he didn't want to lose his wife. So he signed a deal with the devil, so to speak. And the deal with the devil represents that his life became one of control and bitterness and fear. He was driven by fear and anger and rage and control. And we can do that too. in much less dramatic ways without the shiny black helmet and black cape. We can make our life small in the hopes to make our pain more manageable. Or we can find people large enough to hold us. I was thinking about that today in my own personal life. I'm so grateful for my therapist. And she's not going to live forever. She's some 30 years older than me or so. And eventually she's going to not be here. And besides my wife and my family, who sometimes, of course, can hold space for me, which is a joy, a blessing, I need somebody in my life that can hold my feelings with me. That's why I go to therapy, to share it. And I learn and I grow, but mostly I share my life with somebody. And in so doing, I am made larger and more whole. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "It is not impermanence that makes us suffer. It's not death, in other words, that makes us suffer. What makes us suffer is wanting things to be permanent when they are not." And as we see vividly on the news, and those of you who live in Southern California see when you walk out your front door and you see the smoke, even structures are not permanent. And the audacity to be you, as I was trying to come up with a summary chapter, a concluding chapter, I came up with, again, the 3 ideas that I saw as the most common themes in my work in psychotherapy. The things that I revisit. One of the ideas that I've been talking about lately is that we ask too small of a question. And when we can't seem to find an answer to a question, if a question, as Alan Watts, the Buddhist teacher, said, if a question remains permanently insoluble, he says, we must consider that it is a question being asked in the wrong way. So it has to be bigger. So these are the 3 biggest ideas that I came with to summarize my own work in therapy, my own process of learning to love my horrible, rotten self. I won't mention number 1 and number 2 because that's not the focus of tonight's, but the third one was learn how to die again and again. Contexts, ideas, circumstances, and people. One of the things that I'm so grateful for is how I have unlearned lessons in my life. I believe different things than I did just a few years ago. And of course, many things differently than I did many years ago. I believe and think about the world in different ways than I did when I was younger. And there's a grief and a loss there. And then my children come along and I think to myself, like most parents do, many parents do, I'm going to teach them about life. And that doesn't go well. And they're teaching me, and I'm learning that I'm the one who's going to have to expand. And especially when I come up against somebody's unsolvable problem, because my children, as all of us do, have unsolvable problems. And what is my relationship to those unsolvable problems? And the one we're talking about tonight is the eventual loss of something. Grief is as nonlinear as it can be. It goes backwards and forwards. When I work with somebody in grief, 1 week they're talking about feeling relieved, happy. The person that they lost isn't suffering anymore. And so on and so on. And they'll ask me, am I doing it wrong? Am I not grieving? And I'll simply say to them, I think that's a part of it. A week or 2 later, they're in a sad, dark place. And they think, well, I wasn't grieving before, so now I'm in this place. And they ask me, was I doing it wrong? Am I doing it wrong? Am I stuck? And I say, no, this is what grief looks like on other days, on other weeks. It can look like anything. So while we have Kubler-Ross's grief cycle from the 1970s, the denial, the anger, the bargaining, the depression, and the acceptance, all grief models since then have incorporated the entire rainbow of feelings. And that you can go backwards and forwards, and something can hit you in a wave 6 months from now. And that's a part of the process. So there is, in a sense, not one right way, not one template. We move through it and it moves through us. And in a way, it's surrendering to life. Leonard Cohen wrote, If you don't become the ocean, you'll be seasick every day. That's really what my work is about for you as a individual in relationship to a romantic partner, to life, to your work, to our culture, to politics, to news, to entertainment, to art, to your child, to your parents, to your family of origin. You learn to become the ocean. You learn that you are a part of life and death. I used to say to Peter all the time, I lean over to the left because I have some of his ashes in a little statue on my shelf behind me. And he was very sick and struggled with his health. And I would say to him, you know, one of us is going to be alive on this earth without the other one someday. We would talk about that all the time. And then we would talk about the grateful and the fun times that we had. I remember the last few fun conversations I had with him on the phone. I was talking about a trip because he loved to travel. He inspired me to travel. And he just said, I don't think I'm going to be able to do that anymore. And I got quiet. I said, yeah, it sounds like you might not be able to do that. And then we talked about some of our trips that we had together. And I thanked him because I didn't love travel until I met him, until I spent time with him. The poet Rilke wrote, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final. That's what this is about, is we just keep going. But we do it together. And I would tell you that most of the struggles that I had in my life, it wasn't that my life was harder than other people. It was fairly average. I had some hard things. But it was because my father wasn't there and because my mother was incapable emotionally of being there for me, with me. She was cold. And I didn't think about that at the time. I knew she was somewhat formal and distant. And now I know what that coldness did to me and for me. It left me alone. It left me thinking that something was wrong with me. Rumi wrote that the cure for the pain is in the pain. There's no way around it. There's no speech. I wrote the very first story in the Journey of the Heroic Parent is about the client that I call Adam, and about where he shared the loss of his mother, which I knew about, but it came up during one of our groups where he became agitated and argumentative with other people in the group. And when I went over and sat by him and he told me that that's what he was feeling, I realized what the task was as a therapist, was just to sit there with him on that broken down fence in the rain and cry with him. I had no technique, no tool, no look on the bright side speech, just my human presence. And I hear from him from time to time. And I'm grateful. I have a couple of poems I want to read to you tonight. Khalil Gibran wrote, and a woman spoke, saying, tell us of pain. And he said, your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. Even as the stone of the fruit must break, that its heart may stand up, may stand in the sun, so must you know pain. And could you keep your heart in wonder at the daily miracles of your life, your pain would not seem less wondrous than your joy. And you would accept the seasons of your heart, even as you have always accepted the seasons that pass over you in the fields. And you would watch with serenity through the winters of your grief. Much of your pain is self-chosen. It is the bitter potion by which the physician within you heals your sick self. Therefore trust the physician, and drink his remedy in silence and tranquility. For his hand, though heavy and hard, is guided by the tender hand of the unseen. And the cup he brings, though it burn your lips, has been fashioned by the clay which the potter has moistened with his own sacred tears. What I know about my pain today is that it's the strongest and clearest, most profound evidence that I'm alive. And since I treasure this life and its fleeting nature, there is a kind of gratitude in my pain. Can't escape it, but it is colored by this idea. It's funny in this poem, he said, you would accept the seasons of your heart even as you accepted the seasons that pass over your fields. I've lived in Utah now for 30 years or so. Grew up in Southern California, Los Angeles area, in Orange County. And I hated the seasons. We're in the middle of winter right now. I used to complain about with my therapist at the beginning of every session. I took the liberty of complaining about the cold and the inversion with the smog and the overcast skies and the fact that we don't see the sun for days and days and days here. And in a sense, that was because I didn't know how to be the ocean. And I've learned in the past few years, with some of the losses I've had and some of the surrender, I've learned to value the winters when all of the leaves fall and the plants look dead and everything is buried. It's just part of it. And it's not because I've changed my relationship to death, it's because I've changed my relationship to life. When I was a young therapist working in wilderness therapy, there was this drawing on a page about substance use. And it showed this flow chart that you have this loss, and then you have this pain and grief, and if you go through the pain and grief, you heal. And they had these two arrows pointing that if you use self-medicating or distracting behaviors, that you forever stay stuck in it, bitter and closed, empty and small and shallow. The first couple of times I saw the workbook, because we would give this workbook out, I didn't recognize that it was pre-printed. I thought somebody had written that. I'd drawn this little flow chart that I've tried to recreate on the slides if you're watching live. And then I learned after seeing it a couple of times that's the same drawing the other kid had. And then I realized it was pre-printed. This particular page was pre-printed. But it's that simple. But remember, to do that, to walk through our pain and our grief, we are best served by doing it with somebody else, not alone. Sure, there are moments of retreat. There are moments of silence. There are moments of sitting with yourself. But over the long course of our life, the connection to another person is the thing that makes us more connected to ourselves. You want to know how to find yourself? The name of our program is Finding You. Find somebody who can find you. Spend some time with somebody that can see you. Spend some time somebody that can sit with you in your pain, in your loneliness, in your otherness. And you do that long enough and you will repair the losses, the abandonments that you've experienced in your life. You will find yourself. Jessica Benjamin, who wrote a book on attachment theory, said, the root of the self is found through another person. It is when somebody finds us that we have that experience of, oh, there I am. Here I am. The person who recommended that I do this broadcast sent me their slides, and I was so grateful. Nobody ever shares their slides with me. And they shared this little drawing. And for those of you that are listening, I'll try my best to tell you it. It has two separate linear processes of grief. And it's just 4 circles, side to side, 2 different rows. And on the top row, it says people think of grief, and it shows a circle, and it's completely filled up with red. That's what people think of grief is, that it fills us, it overwhelms us. The world becomes a very, very sad place. And then the idea is that the grief gets smaller over time. And as the circles move to the right along this flow chart, the grief gets smaller and smaller. And that top line says, that's what people think of grief, that it slowly gets smaller with time. Then the second row of circles are a little bit different. It starts off the same. In reality, it starts off with grief is filling up the circle. And then the circle gets larger. The grief stays the same size, but the circle gets larger. And I shared this with you tonight because that's true of all of it. My children, when I was in my 20s, I was smaller than I am today. I hope to be bigger than I am today, than I am today. And in some ways, the challenges of my life have gotten larger. Even the challenges with my children in some ways have gotten larger. At least cumulatively they have, for sure, over time. But what makes it more manageable is not that they've gotten smaller or faded, is that I've become larger through the process I've been describing through you this evening, by sitting somebody larger than me. So some of the things I wanted to point out tonight is that the only way through grief is through. The only way through a feeling is through it. The cure for the pain is in the pain. What we think is a detour is actually the way. Somebody once taught me that in any kind of therapy, especially grief therapy, that sometimes people need a glue and sometimes they need a solvent. Sometimes they need to be regulated and sometimes they need to be asked more questions, in other words. Sometimes we open them up with our questions and sometimes we just listen. And that's true of therapy, that's true of parenting, that's true of everything. So I always ask people, do you think your client, do you think your child, do you think the person needs a glue or a solvent? Sometimes we process our grief through art, various forms of art like poetry, music, sometimes nature. Groups are a big part of it because they speak to that important core piece that I'm talking about tonight, that we do better in groups. Of course, psychotherapy, mindfulness and meditation, and even work, recreation, and time off. Sometimes people have opinions about when someone should go back to work, and we don't know. When I've experienced some of my most difficult moments, I needed work. I needed it. I remember one time I went and played tennis with a friend, and I didn't want to after I was going through my only divorce, my first marriage. And my friend shoved me and got me to go play tennis with him. First of all, I beat him, which I usually didn't do. He beat me 19 times out of 20, but this night I beat him soundly because I had a different perspective. It was a release. Losing a game wasn't anything. So there was no risk. There was no anxiety. And I played my best game. Sometimes we need time off. Sometimes we need recreation. And sometimes we need work. So when we have the idea that we know what somebody needs, we can remember that we don't. Now, they might show it to us, but ideally we listen. Ideally, we support them in getting what they need. Like I mentioned, some people talk about doing it in an intensive. In acute, raw grief, intensives are going to be pretty simple. Maybe some ceremonies, maybe some writing, maybe some talking, but mostly not a lot of interventions or exercises, but just listening, just feeling, just being with your pain. It's important. They teach you when you're learning about helping people with grief, find somebody that's not grieving the same thing as you, because they're grieving it in a different way, from a different relationship. And that's why families struggle so much when they lose somebody. Because whereas most of the time families can be there for each other, but if a family, for example, loses a child or a relative or a home, they have ideas about their own grief that don't quite line up with other people's processes. And then that ends up fueling the shame, fueling the anger, and the disconnect. So finding a professional or somebody that is not grieving the same thing at the same time. There's no set time. There's no set path. There's this recognition of life and loss. Quotes and reassuring comments will often feel shaming. I hear this from people constantly in the acute stages of grief. When people give them quotes like, grief is the price that we pay for loving, for example, which is true. It's a true statement. But to say somebody that's in acute grief just makes them feel ashamed, like they should be over it, that they should be grateful for it, that they should be feeling something that they're not feeling. Grief is almost always complicated. And if you lose a house to a fire that you don't even live in anymore, and people might say, well, that's not a big deal. That gets stacked upon other things that you've lost. And so the extent you haven't learned to live with grief and loss and love and life, having any kind of loss can bring it all back up, can bring the feelings that are unsettled all back up. So it's almost always, I treat it like it's always complicated, like it's always complex. And I'm informed in large part by the way people have responded to my grief. Co-regulation, gathering with others, ceremonies and rituals can help. Somebody once told me that coming up to a holiday, that they had to learn that some things are going to be the same and some things are going to be different. That's a part of the grief process. And of course, from Ecclesiastes, for everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What this tells me and speaks to me about is this idea that if we have come to encounter our own darkness, our own grief, our own loss, our own pain, we realize what other people need. And that is for us to be with their pain and their loss when and if we are asked. And the last poem I want to share with you is also from Khalil Gibran, from the Prophet, on joy and sorrow. Then a woman said, "Speak to us of joy and sorrow." And he answered, "Your joy is your sorrow unmasked. And the self-same well from which your laughter rises was oftentimes filled with your tears. And how else can it be? The deeper that sorrow carves into your being, the more joy you can contain. Is not the cup that holds the wine the very cup that was burned in the potter's oven? And is not the lute that soothes your spirit the very wood that was hollowed with knives? When you are joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find that it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy. And when you are sorrowful, look again in your heart, and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight. Some of you say joy is greater than sorrow, and others say, nay, sorrow is the greater. But I say unto you, they are inseparable. Together they come, and when one sits alone with you at your board, remember that the other one is asleep upon your bed. Verily, you are suspended like scales between your sorrow and your joy. Only when you are empty are you at a standstill and balanced. And when the treasure keeper lifts his way to weigh his gold and his silver, needs must your joy and sorrow rise or fall. We lose identity, we lose time. Losing Kobe was losing a part of my children's childhood. The losses of those houses, even if you didn't live there, is the loss of something that means something that you identify with. And it brings up our own existential anxiety about our own life. And to the extent we haven't understood the temporal nature of our own life, we'll be uncomfortable with our grief. I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2015. And for those of you that are hearing this, I'm doing fine with it. I'm medicated and everything is going fine. My symptoms are stabilized and my scans look good. So just to comfort you. But I went through a period of depression right after I was diagnosed, and grief, intense grief and loss and sadness, anger and bitterness, the entire stage, the entire gamut. But what came out of that was gratitude. Because I realized it's just going to get worse and worse. It's just going to get worse and worse. And this might be the best it ever is. And if I spend time missing the opportunity to feel and to grieve, I spend time missing the opportunity to be grateful for what I have right now. I went out to the wilderness some months after I was diagnosed, and I was sitting in the cold wilderness, and I've hated the cold my entire life. Growing up, coming from Southern California, I was angry at cold. I was angry at the tilt of the earth. I was angry at the angle of the sun. As insane as that is. But when I felt my toes hurting like they do when they get cold, I remember being grateful. Because part of my symptoms are that I have numbness in my hands and feet, neuropathy. And I remember feeling the cold in my toes, and for the first time in my life, I felt grateful that I could feel. If trauma and grief can't be shared, it doesn't move through us. And really, this is about resilience. If we can be there for each other, if we can expand and become larger, we are contributing to the resilience of others. Sometimes the loss is a fantasy of what could have been, like with my father, or maybe your child. So many people tell me and are stuck in the grief about their child, as their child has gone off course with mental health or addiction issues. That is something worth listening to. That is something worth sitting with and worth sharing. Find new ways to invest. Sometimes people find purpose in their grief. They look to help others with mental health issues or suicide or suicidality or addiction, or who have lost a house. Sometimes we just take it a day at a time. I remember saying to one of my very first clients who had the most extreme story of sexual and physical abuse, and I said to her one day in just awe and wonder, and I said, "How do you do it?" And she just looked at me and she said, "How do you do it?" She didn't know my story. She didn't know what was going on in my life. I was going through my first divorce. And in so doing, that meant that my children weren't with me every day. I didn't get to watch them every day in the simple, boring moments that you get when you live with your children. So she asked me very plainly, "How do you do it?" And it was the first time I realized I do it one day at a time. That's how I do it. Some things change and some things remain the same. Get support from people who can give it. One of the mistakes I see people make all the time is asking for validation and support from people who are incapable of giving it to them. Do your own grief, work on your own grief, and let others do theirs. You don't need to rescue or make them feel better. Mostly what you give them is your heart, your soul, your listening. And when I say soul, I don't mean anything except for just your deepest, wisest, most present, most authentic self. Be careful about over-identifying and thinking that you know what they need or what they want or what the grief will look like for them, or even what their relationship to the thing is or the person is or was. Ask questions. Let them tell stories. I remember when Kobe died, because I wasn't the only one in my family that was hit by it really hard. My daughter sent me some videos of him, some funny videos of him saying and doing funny things. And I remember how that soothed me because I got to watch that. And again, I didn't know him. It was just, he just meant something to us as a family. He was like the hearth that we gathered around growing up. Ask questions and listen. Let them tell their stories. And stay with them so that they can stay with themselves in their grief. All right, folks. Thank you for joining me this evening. My two books are The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You. They can be found on Audible and on Amazon. Like I mentioned at the outset, if you're waiting to go to an intensive, wait no longer. February 19th is the next opening. When we closed our old program and then reorganized to be just our intensive program, I had many people reach out to me and said they had put it off and they thought it had gone away. Well, you never know. So join us as soon as possible. And I can almost guarantee you that it'll be transformative, even if you come with your skepticism, with your doubts, with your anxiety. Contact us at info@findingyouprograms.com to sign up, to learn more, or to find out about private, customized intensives. My next broadcast will be on finding compassion for self and others. And that'll be a week from today, Tuesday, January 28th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. I look forward to that. All right, folks. Thank you for joining me. This felt really personal tonight, and I hope it was a helpful point of contact for you. And as I like to say always, thanks for joining me. And for those of you, I want to say on behalf of those of you that are listening and watching, on behalf of the people that love you and that you love, thanks for showing up and doing your work, because it makes all the difference in the world. It is life-changing and it is world-changing. And in a world where we feel so much hopelessness and despair out there, changing one's own soul might be the most radical act that one can engage in. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.